In the last lesson, in our last lesson from Genesis, we studied about the time that Abraham and Sarah went down to the land of Egypt and how they took Lot with them. And when they came back from the land of Egypt, they traveled on northward, past Hebron, where Abraham had settled and where he eventually would settle for the rest of his life. But they went up to the area of Bethel, where Abram had built an altar to the Lord. And he found the altar and he repaired it. And then Lot and Abraham's herdsmen have trouble. And Lot goes, when given a choice as to which way he wants to go, Lot goes toward the well-watered plains of the Jordan. And so we sort of studied that in chapters 13, 14, 15. The story of Ishmael and Hagar, the Egyptian handmaiden of Sarah, is in the 16th chapter of Genesis. But I don't want us to overlook chapter 15. Chapter 15 has some of the statements that I hear most often cited about Abraham. God appears to him. His name is still Abram at this point. Soon it's going to change. God will appear to him another time. But he is still called Abram, and Sarai, his wife Sarai, to this point. The Bible says in Genesis 15, verse 10, that God said to him, "Don't fear, Abram, for I am a shield to you, and your reward shall be very great." And so there is a repetition of the promise that the seed of Abraham would become very great, that there would be a multitude of people, and that the land of Canaan would be occupied by Abraham's offspring. But there's one problem, of course, with that. At this point, Abram, and Sarai have no children. And they've looked for a child for 10, 15 years, and none has come. When they came out of Hebron, of the land of Mesopotamia, where the father of Abraham, Terah, died, Abram and Sarai had been looking for a child. None had been born to them. And so there's a repetition of the promise. It will be through you and your seed. Sarah has trouble believing that God will send them a child, that she will have her shame, as it's spoken of in the Bible, when a woman has no children. And so she has trouble believing that there's going to be a change in her life. But the Bible says of Abraham that he believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. Now, the word believe in Greek is the verb form of the word faith. They're connected right together. And you remember that when the Apostle Paul began preaching, that he insisted that salvation was by faith in Jesus Christ. And so he taught the people that. And he looked for passages in the Old Testament that would substantiate him in what he said and what he believed. And one of the passages is here in the 15th chapter of the book of Genesis, and verse 6. The Bible says that Abram believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And Paul cites it more than once. In fact, he cites it twice in the book of Romans and once in Galatians, and James cites it once. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And you see, that was very important to Paul, because it wasn't so much what Abram did, his going down into Egypt, his building altars and offering sacrifices, and his turning to God for guidance in his life. It wasn't what Abram did, it was what he believed in. And so Paul says, we are saved like Abraham. We are saved by the faith that we have in God. Now, the other passages in a different part of the Bible altogether, still in the Old Testament, but it was important for the Apostle Paul. Was in the prophet Habakkuk. Habakkuk is more than just a kind of funny name. It's the one minor prophet that many people will forget. But Habakkuk has only 3 chapters, but they're really great chapters. Habakkuk is sometimes called the debating prophet. He starts out by saying, God, look around you at the land of Israel, and see how they're living. They're breaking your laws on the right and the left. They care nothing for what you have to say. The law of Moses has been all but thrown aside by them. Why do you let this go on, God? And God comes back in the early part of the first chapter. God comes back to the prophet and he says, right now I'm doing something about it, Habakkuk. He says, if you look around you, you'll be surprised at what you see. I've risen up the Chaldeans to the north. They're coming down to the land of Israel. They will be my instrument for wrath because the people have not obeyed God. And so Habakkuk looks and he knows that what God is saying is true. He's heard the rumors. He knows the size of the army of the Chaldeans, presumably the people of Babylon. And so he's not surprised at all. But he turns to God and he says, the Chaldeans. He says they're worse than we are. He says they have a net that they go to the sea and bring up some fish in it, and then they fall down and worship their net. He says the Chaldeans are doing worse things than the people of Israel are. How can you make them your instrument for wrath against them? And so God reasons with Habakkuk. And in the 2nd chapter, in verse 2, it says, God says to Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith. And so those 2 passages are cited often by Paul, and Paul comes back to them. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness, and the just shall live by faith. Well, that's the 16th chapter deals with those kinds of things. The 13th verse in the 15th chapter, I'm in Genesis now, God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. God prophesies to Abraham that his descendants are going to Egypt, and they will live for many years, many decades, in the land of Egypt. In fact, they live there about 400 years. Sometimes we think, well, they've grown from the family of Jacob to such a large number of people, it surely took longer than 400 years. But 400 years is what the Bible gives us. There are 4 times that 400 years is mentioned. First, of course, is here in Genesis 15 and verse 13, but also in Exodus 12 and verse 40, where it is not 400 but 430. And then in Galatians 3:17, it is again 430 years, and Stephen mentions the stay in Egypt in Acts 7 and verse 6, and he also uses the number 400. So 400 or 430 years, it's not a great deal of difference in time. And the people of Israel are going to be in the land of Egypt and grow into a mighty nation before they come back to the land of Canaan. God says in verse 16, still God is talking to Abraham, then in the 4th generation you will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. Now, that passage is often cited. In other words, Abraham is told by God that whenever the people of the land, the Amorites in this case, seems to symbolize all of the people that live in the land of Canaan. And so God tells Abraham that there is still wickedness, that the people who live in the land have to fulfill. They haven't come yet to the point where I'm ready to give you the land. But when the iniquity of the Amorites is filled, then I'll give you all of this land. And that's in verse 16. I hear that verse often cited. God doesn't always render his judgments until people have turned aside from him altogether. And so there will be the fourth generation. They would come back into the land of Canaan. And then verse 18 says, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. What God tells Abraham to bring a ram and a ewe and a small lamb and some birds. And he says, I want you to cut the animals in two, and I want you to pass between them. Apparently the idea was, may this happen to me if I violate the covenant that I'm making with God. And so Abraham makes the covenant with God, and of course we know how the story turns out, that there are children of Abraham, and later on Isaac, his son, has two sons, and then from Jacob's children they become nations of 70, 75 people, and then over the time, over some 400 years, they become a mighty nation. Well, we're studying about Sarah and the Egyptian handmaiden Hagar in the lesson today in the 16th chapter. It says, I'm reading from the New American Standard Version, so I think I'll read from the New King James, since the New King James is in the workbooks that many people will have. It says, now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. And so the problem is still there. Where is this great generation, this multitude of people that are going to live in the land of Canaan? Where are they to come from? When will Egypt become a mighty nation? Or when will Israel become a mighty nation? And she, it says that Sarah had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. Now, we're given no explanation of where Hagar came from in Egypt, but it would be reasonable to think that when Abraham and Sarah went down because of the famine, went down and stayed in the land of Egypt for a time, that among the things that Pharaoh gave Abraham and Sarah as blessings when they left the land of Egypt, that among them was this Egyptian handmaid, the handmaid of Sarah, whose name is Hagar. And Sarah, of course, has a way that she thinks is going to solve the problem. She says, since I can't have a child, and incidentally, stories like this come out of the background of Mesopotamia in other instances as well, where a wife may feel that she can't have a child, and so she gives her handmaiden to Abraham and says to Abraham, the child that's born will be my child, Sarah says. And that way we can, the family of Abraham can carry on. But Sarah obviously has trouble believing that she is an old woman, and she is old by this time, 90 plus years old, that she has trouble believing that she's going to have a child. And so she says to Abraham, let the child of Hagar be our child. Now, Abraham has some problems with this, and he says to God, why don't you have my servant Eliezer, who's from Damascus? That's another person, a slave that Abraham has, that we don't exactly know where it comes from. He just sort of crops up in the story. But apparently he was a trusted man, Eliezer, a good man. And so Abraham wants a child of Eliezer to be his child. And so the peopling of the land can come about through the offspring of Eliezer. Eliezer, incidentally, it appears to be a Hebrew version of the name Lazarus that occurs in the New Testament, of the rich man and Lazarus of that parable. Although, of course, there's another Lazarus that Jesus raises from the dead. And so, in time, Hagar conceives and bears a child, and she names the child Ishmael. Now, once again, we're confronted with a thing here in Genesis that I frankly don't know what to do with. But there's more than one instance where the second child, the second male, becomes the heir of the blessings of the father. There's Cain and Abel. God favored Abel, but Cain is the oldest child. And then in the story of Abraham, Ishmael is the oldest child. Isaac is the second child that is born to him. And then later on, when Isaac has children, it is Esau and Jacob. But of course, Jacob is the second one that is born. Esau, he has to buy the birthright and the blessing of his father from Isaac. And so it's another instance of that happening. It's that way right to the end of Genesis. Joseph, there's no tribe of Joseph. But Joseph has two sons, each of whom become heads of tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. And in that case, Manasseh is the oldest child. But the right hand of Jacob goes on the head of Ephraim, the second child. He's the one that is to be the heir of the blessing. And so it happens that way in Genesis several times, and I have no explanation for it. I don't know what that's about. In the next chapter of Genesis, now we will wait for that, but God appears to Abraham a second time and institutes the covenant of circumcision, and all of that comes when Isaac is born. But Isaac was actually born several years. Ishmael is a teenager by the time Ishmael is a teenager by the time Isaac is born. So going on with the chapter, the thing with Hagar, we might be inclined to say, I told you so, but there is problems in the family because of that. Hagar despises her mistress. She despises Sarai because the child belongs to Sarai. And of course you can see where a mother's love would want the child to belong to her, to Hagar. And so Abraham says to Sarah, do whatever you want to do. Do whatever you think is best. And so she sends Hagar and the child away. And they go into the wilderness. Is that Ren making noise? But Hagar takes the child and leaves and goes. The word beer, B-E-E-R, is on the front of many words in the Old Testament, and it means well. And so she sits down. There is apparently an opening or something where the scrub brush won't be so bad. And so Hagar sits down with her child. She is going to leave the child behind, Ishmael. She doesn't want to watch him die. But an angel of the Lord appears. Again, it's a sort of an oddity of the Bible that you may or may not be interested in. But that where the word angel appears, in the New King James Version, and in some other translations as well, his name will be spelled angel. He is an angel of the Lord. And so it will be spelled uppercase A. An angel of the Lord appears. Now, why would that be? There's no uppercase in the Hebrew alphabet. The letters are written the same. And so what's the significance? Why would the translators have put that the angel of the Lord appears to Hagar and gives her a message, an important message? Well, for a long time, Bible translators or Bible interpreters have thought that through the book of Genesis and at other places in the Bible, that the pre-incarnate Christ, that's what they'll tell you, the pre-incarnate Christ appears, the angel of the Lord. Now, in the book of Daniel, he appears sometimes, and it's spelled with an uppercase letter. That's why the New King James has the angel of the Lord with an uppercase A, the angel of the Lord. And when he's referred to, he, the angel, will be spelled with an uppercase H, just like God. Just like God's name will be spelled with an uppercase letter. And a pronoun will have an uppercase letter referring to it. And so that angel of the Lord, you see, there is more to that than just the accidental use of the uppercase letter, angel of the Lord. I'm trying to find, in verse 9, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress. And in verse 9, the angel of the Lord, the Lord is Yahweh there, and so he is the angel of Yahweh. He is the angel of the God that Abraham is coming to know and coming to worship. And so the word angel appears 2 or 3 times. In verse 7 it also appears, the angel of the Lord, but always with an uppercase A. And that's why the uppercase A is there. Now, you might object. You might say, well, now, I don't know that that's the pre-incarnate Christ, and I don't think the translators of the Bible have the right to try to force me to believe that that is the pre-incarnate Christ, the angel of the Lord that appears to Hagar. Well, you don't have to accept it if you don't want to, then just buy another translation. Because the New American Standard Version and other translations are going to use an uppercase A there, because theologically, not because of anything that has to do with the language, but because theologically, doctrinally, they have come to understand the angel of the Lord there to be the pre-incarnate Christ. Well, the angel of the Lord tells Hagar that she is to go back home and submit herself to her mistress, to Sarai. And so she leaves to go back that direction. But before she goes, the angel of the Lord gave a message to her. Behold, you are with child, you shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction, and he shall be a wild man, she says, of Ishmael. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand will be against him. There is a place in verse 10 when the Bible says, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. In other words, they will be too big to count. There will be too many of them. Nobody will be able to count them. And so Hagar, the Egyptian handmaiden, goes back and she continues to raise her son Ishmael in the family circle. They're in the area of Hebron by now, in the family circle where Abraham and Sarah prevail. Now, we'll come across them again. There is a spring that is there, and it is named That is, Hagar's going there while she is pregnant with Ishmael has to do also with the naming of that oasis, that spring that is there. But that too will be expanded on, and the name Beersheba, the well of the seven. See, Shabbat is seven, and so the naming of that spring will also be involved in this. But Beersheba doesn't come up here. It will come up when there is a king of the Philistines who will appear. He's already appeared once, but we'd have to go back yet another chapter in order to find that. But his name is Abimelech. Now, Abimelech, there will be him, and then another king of the Philistines that is mentioned to Isaac, to Isaac later on. And his name too will be Abimelech. But there are so many years involved that it could hardly be the same man. Well, there is also a son of Gideon by the name of Abimelech. And the word Abimelech in Hebrew means, my father was a king. And so that's one way for him to establish legitimacy. I didn't have to fight a battle. The gods, or God, has guided me so that I am the ruler of this country and so on. But it was my father before me and then me. And it's because we have been favored by God. It is interesting that he should be called the king of the Philistines at this point, Abimelech. Both of the kings that appear, are kings of the Philistines. Now, Abraham never gets into Philistine territory, but the Philistines have 5 cities. There are 5 lords of the Philistines, right along the coast in the south part of the land of Israel. They're not far from what the Gaza Strip is today. Gaza was one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. But the Philistines are known from the secular record as well as from the Bible. But the problem is that the ones that are known from the secular history could not have been this early. My own suspicion is that the area was the Philistine area, and whoever predominated, whatever people predominated in that area were the Philistines. They lived in the land of Philistia. But it is true that outside the Bible, the Philistines are connected with the island of Crete and with the whole Aegean area, for that matter. And we do know that there was a great movement of people down toward the land of Egypt, apparently because of famine or because the people behind them were pressing them farther south. But there are some people, the Philistine people, who are driven off by the Egyptians and who settle along the coast of Canaan. They almost destroy the people of Israel, but never quite. Samson, of course, fought against the Philistines, and there were several of the Shamgar killed 500 Philistines, and so there are several cases where the Philistines, several instances where the Philistines appear as they are later on, but they're a different people in the way they're dressed, and from the period of time when the Egyptians leave pictures. The Philistines have on a different kind of dress, and they're more Greek-like. They seem to be from that part of the world. Well, thank you for paying attention, and I hope that this was of some benefit, help to you, Hagar and Sarah, and we will go on from the study in Genesis from there. Thank you for listening.